Okay guys, Timmy coming at you here. And today what we're going to do is we're going to go over the skeletal system, and specifically what I want to do is go over the physiology of bone. What's bone all about? Alright, just a couple of things real quick. First of all, the skeletal system is divided into two major parts. The part I got circled here in red, that's referred to as the axial skeleton. And anything hanging off the axial skeleton, like the arms and the legs, is what's referred to as the appendicular or appendages, right? That's the appendicular skeleton. All right. What I really want to do, though, is talk to you about the physiology and some of the anatomy of the bone. All right. So let's go over some of the functions of bones. First of all, bones support you, right? They provide the framework for the body and supporting soft tissue, right? Your skull and your vertebrae protect your brain and spinal cord, your rib cage for your thoracic cavity, you know, the organs, the lungs, the heart, of course. And it also allows for connection of tendons and ligaments, so it allows for movement too, right? One of the big things about bone is it's involved in hematopoiesis, making blood cells. As a matter of fact, the bone marrow is where you make all blood cells: white blood cells, red blood cells, platelets. And remember, platelets are little plates, and they're involved in blood clotting, just like Piglet was a little pig. Anyways, a couple of other things about that, right? Bone is where you store 99% of all your calcium, right? So the other thing is that it's also a storage of energy too. So there's yellow marrow in bone, and that yellow marrow is actually fat. So it can be a reserve of energy in time of really severe caloric restriction. Like right now, I'm really hungry, but I digress. So what I want to do now is I want to go over some of excuse me, the major parts of bone. And this is the stuff that I really want you to know. All right? So if you look at a long bone, first of all, you got to know some anatomical terms, right? The ends of long bones are called the epiphysis. Wait, I got to stop now. Okay, so the long end of the ends of bones are called the epiphysis, and you have a proximal epiphysis and a distal epiphysis. What I really want you to know is that on the ends of long bones, in bones in general, but especially in long bones, you have the proximal and distal epiphyseal plates or epiphyseal lines. And these cells are loaded, or this area is loaded with cells that actually build bone. So this is what allows bone to get longer. Now, bone is really very, very metabolically active. People think that it's just kind of sitting there. It really isn't. As a matter of fact, every 10 years, your bone completely turns over, meaning that the amount of calcium and phosphate that make up bone, you have new calcium and new phosphate after 10 years. So there's the constant breaking down and rebuilding of bone. Now, just like all the other organs, you have a saran wrap that covers bone directly. So if you go to KFC and you get the 8-piece family meal, when you start gnawing on that chicken leg, when you get down to the bone, you start chewing on that little waxy, thin waxy film around your bone. That's referred to as the periosteum. And the periosteum is loaded with these specialized bone cells called osteoblasts. And osteoblasts, blast B, build bone. Now, you have the medullary cavity. This is where the bone marrow is located. And within that lining of the medullary cavity, you have what's called the endosteum. And the endosteum is located with these loaded with these specialized bone cells called osteoclasts. And osteoclasts break down bone. So it makes perfect sense. It's actually kind of beautiful. Now look, if you took a big piece of PVC pipe and it was solid, there was no hole in it, right? That stuff is heavy. But if you hollow it out, it becomes very, very light. But the strength of that PVC pipe is still really, really strong. So while osteoclasts are kind of hollowing out the bone, osteoblasts are building the bone. So even though the inner part is relatively hollow, when I say relative because there's bone marrow in it, the tensile strength of bone is extremely strong. As a matter of fact, it's stronger than steel in terms of its weight. Its strength to weight ratio, bone is actually stronger. Now, on the ends of bones, you have what are called articulating cartilage. And this is basically cushioning where two bones form a joint. And if you think of articulating cartilage, think of if you got hardwood floors, you know how you put those little cushiony things underneath furniture so it doesn't scratch your floor? Articulating cartilage is similar to that. And joints that require or that have a lot of force and a lot of pressure, like the joints in your knees, they have additional supporting cartilage, and those are called meniscus. But anyways, that's the articulating cartilage. So again, using the same deal, you go to KFC, you get the 8-piece family meal. And when you're chewing on the bone, when you chew on the end of the bone, that little rubbery part at the end, that's the articulating cartilage. And in people where the articulating cartilage is worn away, you get bone rubbing on bone, and anytime you damage tissue, and we know the bone is living tissue, you're going to get inflammation, and they get arthritis. So that's what happens when you get old. Trust me. I know. Now, let's take a little closer look at the inside of the bone. And I talked to you about yellow marrow, right? So there's red marrow, and red marrow is involved in hematopoiesis, or blood cell production. Right? But then you also have yellow marrow, and yellow marrow is basically fat. But here's the interesting point. In times of severe bleeding, yellow marrow can actually get converted to red marrow and begin the process of making more red blood cells. Here's the other thing from a clinical standpoint. When people break bone, what can happen is a piece of this fat, this yellow marrow, can actually break off, and it can actually enter the blood supply. And this person, if the break is bad enough, they can get what's called a fat embolism. So one of the things that physicians and nurses worry about after breaking a bone is the potential for fat embolism. And to a large degree, there's not too much you can do about that. It's kind of hit or miss. Here's the other thing I'd like to point out, is that bone is living tissue. So there are small perforations in bone. And these little holes allow nerves and blood vessels to get into the inner part of the bone. That way, when you make new red blood cells, they're able to be dumped into the central circulation and be used. Now, a couple of other things. When you look at long bones, we talked about these epiphyseal plates or epiphyseal lines. And these epiphyseal plates are loaded with cells called osteoblasts, right? And remember, osteoblasts are specialized bone cells that build bone. They lay down calcium and phosphorus. And that's the basic matrix or the makeup of bone. Now, there are hormones that affect or can inhibit or stimulate these osteoblasts. And two of the big ones growing up, number one is human growth hormone. So human growth hormone profoundly stimulates these osteoblasts as kids are growing. So they're going to stimulate the osteoblasts and allow the bones to get longer, and hence the name human growth hormone. And human growth hormone is secreted by the pituitary gland. We learned about this, or we will. And it's secreted at night. So kids actually grow the most at night. And kids, as their bones are growing, they can actually kind of outgrow the growing potential of the muscle and tendon, and they can get growing pains. So that's a real thing. Here's the other thing. The two hormones that affect bone are estrogen and testosterone. Now, if you remember, estrogen in women, they get their period between 11 and 13 roughly. So the ovaries are going to start secreting estrogen, and estrogen is a powerful stimulator of osteoblasts. So osteoblasts again build bone. So that's why in 7th and 8th grade, my kid he looks like a kid, right? Like a little kid. And his 8th grade graduation class, I see these girls coming out of going to the graduation. I'm like, they look like women. That's because estrogen stimulates osteoblasts, and girls tend to be taller than boys in junior high. However, testosterone, guys hit it between 13 and 15. And testosterone really stimulates osteoblasts. That's why guys tend to be taller than women. Here's the other interesting thing, and it's important to note. These epiphyseal plates, these growth plates, once they seal, the bone can't get any longer. So in women, the epiphyseal plates typically seal at the age of 17. So how tall you was at 17 is probably how tall you is now. Here's the other thing. For guys, the epiphyseal plates don't seal until they're about 24. So testosterone still has a profound effect upwards of the age of 24. That's why when a scout is looking at a high school kid and he's, let's say, 6'1" and he weighs 180 pounds, based on the fact that they don't seal until they're 24, that scout expects that kid to become a little taller and a little beefier. So that's why they look at that. Now, when you talk about human growth hormone, HGH, there's a condition called dwarfism. And dwarfism is a lack of human growth hormone. So if you remember Jackass, the movie, and Wee Man, if you look at Wee Man, he had a relatively normal sized gourd and trunk, but he had short arms and legs and kind of sausagey short fingers and toes. That's because human growth hormone has a profound effect on the long bones of the body. Now, the opposite is gigantism. And that's a condition where you have excessive amounts of human growth hormone. And this is the important piece. If you have excessive amounts of human growth hormone produced by the pituitary gland before the epiphyseal plate seal, then you will become a giant. Now, if you get excessive amounts of human growth hormone released after the epiphyseal plate seal, you're not going to get taller. You will get a condition that's called acromegaly. And that's where the bones become thicker. The bones of the skull, they'll get the supraorbital ridge. They will get the big kind of Lincoln log legs. But they won't get taller. So one of the things that I like to think about, because it's like, to me it's incredible, is what are the odds of someone actually becoming a giant and their last name was the Giant, like Andre the Giant? Like, what are the odds of him actually becoming a giant? Anyways, one more thing I'd like to talk to you about is basically the formation of bone and the clinical application of that. Now, all bones start out as kind of like a model of cartilage. And we know cartilage, like the cartilage in your nose, right? The nasal septum is cartilage, so you can bend your nose without breaking it. And then as the bones begin to take on more calcium and phosphate, they begin to harden. This is the point, is that kids, typically under the age of 3, right, they have a lot of cartilage in their bones. So anytime a kid, especially under the age of 3, comes in with a broken bone and no other injury other than a broken bone, especially like a broken humerus, right, the upper part of the arm, you have to assess for child abuse, because it takes a tremendous amount of pressure to break a child's bone because they haven't completely ossified. They're kind of rubbery. It's like trying to break like a fresh branch off a tree, right? It's really difficult to do because it's rubbery. Now, look, not to say it doesn't happen, it does happen. My point is that if you're in healthcare, especially in an emergency room, one of the things you have to do is you have to work that up. You have to ask questions about that. So that's what I wanted to talk to you about bone. You should know the parts of the bone. You should know the osteoblasts and osteoclasts, their function, where they're located, the function of the epiphyseal plate, the function of articulating cartilage, right? And some of the hormones that affect it. Now, and I'm going to be really brief about this because we covered this more in advanced. A couple of things. The goal of the body, and I haven't pulled this one out in a while, is to maintain homeostasis, right? So there are 2 hormones that are involved in maintaining blood levels of calcium. And the control of calcium is very, very important. And normal blood levels of calcium, blood levels, is between 9.5 and 10.5. And that's a really, really tight range. And the reason it's tight is because low calcium or high calcium can have profound effects on the body, especially the nervous system. With that said, there are two hormones that control blood levels of calcium. Number one is parathyroid hormone. And parathyroid hormone, oddly enough, is released from the parathyroid gland. So I'm going to try to draw a thyroid gland. Kind of looks like this, right? So this is your thyroid gland in your neck. And then your parathyroid gland is actually 4 little glands that kind of surround the thyroid gland. That's why it's called the parathyroid gland. And the parathyroid gland releases, obviously enough, parathyroid hormone. And the function of parathyroid hormone is to increase blood levels of calcium. Increase it. Then you have specialized cells within the thyroid gland itself that release another hormone. And that hormone is called calcitonin. Now, if parathyroid, the function of parathyroid hormone is to increase blood levels of calcium, I'm spitballing here, what do you think calcitonin does? Calcitonin decreases blood levels of calcium. So these two hormones are intimately involved in maintaining blood levels of calcium. So that's all I really wanted to talk to you about the physiology of bone. Your ultimate job is to, in general, is to learn the bones and their location. All right? And I hope this helped.